The offices of LumaVest Studios should have been empty by midnight, but that night the 34th floor still held its breath. The glass-walled conference room, built to drink in daylight, was now a dim aquarium of shadow and moonlight. Reflections of the sleeping city floated across the windows. But inside, everything felt strangely still, like a room after an argument. The big central table, usually a carefully curated display of models and samples, looked abandoned mid-thought. Rolled-up blueprints leaned against abandoned coffee cups. Crumpled sketches lay like fallen leaves, scattered pencils pointing nowhere in particular. An unfinished floor plan rested in the center. The outline of a community center traced in fine ink, full of curves meant to welcome and spaces meant to breathe. But somehow, even on paper, it looked tired. Nora Ellis pushed her cleaning cart through the doorway as quietly as she could. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping to frame a face that had learned to hide how exhausted it was. The navy blue custodial uniform hung a little loose on her small frame. A spray bottle swung from the side of her cart, and a tiny Bluetooth speaker sat silent near the handle. She usually filled long nights with soft music, but tonight the hush felt too delicate to disturb. She stepped closer to the table, pausing at the mess of papers. Her eyes lingered on the community center design, noticing the intention in the lines. Light wells, open courtyards, benches drawn like invitations. Whoever drew this cared deeply. But something was missing. She could feel it, the way you can feel when a song never quite reaches its chorus. That's when she saw him. At the head of the table, a man sat hunched over, forearms on the polished surface, head buried in the crook of his elbow. His white shirt sleeves were rolled to his forearms, fabric wrinkled like he'd been fighting with the day for too long. His shoulders moved in small, uneven rhythms, as if he was trying not to fall apart, and failing. The faint glow from the emergency exit light above drew a pale halo around him, but it didn't show his face. Nora hesitated. She'd seen plenty of people passed out at their desks. Junior architects chasing deadlines, assistants asleep over spreadsheets. But this didn't look like exhaustion. This looked like an implosion that happened quietly, after everyone else went home. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask if he was okay. People rarely are when you ask them that at night. Instead, she reached into the cart, pulled out a small box of tissues, and set it gently on the table, close enough for him to find but far enough not to startle him. Then she sat down in the chair beside his, one seat away, leaving a respectful gap between them. She folded her hands in her lap and gazed at the window, at the faint smear of city lights beyond the glass. For a while, the only sounds were the distant hum of the HVAC, the whisper of traffic far below, and the fragile, uneven breaths of a stranger trying to hold himself together. "I've redrawn it 5 times, he said at last, voice rough and low, as if the words had to fight their way out. "And it still doesn't feel right." Nora glanced down at the floor plan again. "I can't get the soul of it," he murmured. "I've lost it. I've lost everything." He wasn't really speaking to her. It sounded more like a confession to the air, to the paper, to the ghosts of every decision that had brought him here. Nora's chest ached in a way she knew too well. The quiet kind of hurt, the kind you live with. "No one loses everything," she said softly, not looking directly at him. "Not if it still matters enough to make you feel this much." He didn't answer. He didn't even lift his head, but his shoulders stopped shaking quite so hard. Nora rose after a moment, moving back to her cart. There were smudges on the glass to wipe, corners to sweep, little tasks that never complained or betrayed anyone. Still, her gaze kept drifting back to the unfinished drawing and the man beside it. This stranger who looked like he'd reached the edge of his own blueprint and found only blank space. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that he was Adrian Cole, the celebrated architect and CEO of LumaVest, a man known for designs that newspapers described as healing spaces. She didn't know that their histories were already entangled, that years ago his signature had quietly redirected the course of her life. All she knew, in that quiet room of paper and shadows, was that someone was breaking in front of her, and that sometimes the smallest kindness, like a tissue box left within reach, was the only scaffolding a person had to start rebuilding. By morning, the city pretended nothing had happened. The small coffee cart behind LumaVest's loading dock hissed and steamed like always, sending up the familiar scent of espresso and burnt sugar into the cold air. Delivery drivers shuffled past. Interns checked their phones with glassy, sleep-deprived eyes. Maintenance staff lined up in uniforms that all looked the same from a distance. Nora stood somewhere in the middle of it all, hugging her arms against the chill. Her navy custodial shirt was a little wrinkled from the night shift, and her bun had loosened just enough for a few strands of hair to escape. Her eyes felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that no amount of caffeine really fixes. $3.90, she muttered to herself, staring at the menu. For a latte, and maybe the universe will finally chill out. Her voice was quiet, half joke, half plea. She didn't notice that someone walking past had stopped. Adrian had come down for his usual morning walk through the garden courtyard, sleeves rolled, sketchbook tucked under his arm like a shield. He almost kept going. He'd learned to move quickly through spaces to avoid being cornered by small talk. But then he heard it. That voice. Calm, slightly sardonic, like someone who'd learned to laugh at life so it wouldn't swallow her. He turned. She looked up at the same time, surprise flickering over her face when recognition clicked. The stranger from the dark room. The man folded over the table, the one who hadn't looked up when she left the tissue box. "Excuse me," he said, a little uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to disturb her daylight. Were you the one from last night?" Nora blinked. "The one who found you having a staring contest with your own blueprints?" she asked. "Yeah, that was me." A faint, embarrassed smile tugged at his mouth. "Thank you," he said quietly, for not letting a stranger completely fall apart alone. She shrugged, but her eyes softened. "You looked like a guy who just watched someone set his favorite drawing on fire." "That's uncomfortably accurate," he admitted. They stood in a small, awkward silence. The barista called the next order. A gull cried somewhere overhead. Life went on, indifferent. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Adrian asked suddenly. "As a thank you." Nora hesitated for a heartbeat. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end of thank you from anyone in a pressed white shirt, but then she nodded. "Sure, I won't say no to free caffeine." He ordered 2 lattes. While the barista worked, he reached for the sugar, tore open 2 packets, and stirred them into 1 cup with slow, careful motions. Then he reached for the little shaker of cinnamon and sprinkled a light dusting over the foam. When he handed it to her, he did it like he was offering something far more fragile than paper cups and milk. She frowned slightly. "How did you—" "You said last night that cinnamon was your cheap version of therapy," he said, almost shy. I remembered. They took their drinks to a nearby concrete bench facing a vertical wall thick with ivy, its leaves still wet from early sprinklers. It was one of Adrian's designs, a cooling wall that softened the afternoon sun, but he didn't say that. Today, he just let it be a wall. They sat in quiet for a moment, sipping. The steam rose between them like something breathing. "So," Nora said at last, glancing sideways at him, "what's your story, Mr. I've lost everything?" He rolled the edge of his sketchbook between his fingers. "Architect," he said simply. "I've been drawing buildings since I was 8. First floor plan I ever made was a treehouse I never built." She smiled faintly. "Mine was a picture book. I drew little creatures that lived behind doorknobs." Her voice went softer. "Then life got expensive. My mom got sick. Bills showed up before dreams did." He nodded slowly, as if her words clicked into place inside him. "I've designed buildings that never got built," he confessed. "Schools, libraries, even a memorial. Sometimes budgets killed them, sometimes politics, and sometimes—" He paused, searching for the truth. "Sometimes I just couldn't make them feel alive." Nora studied his face, the shadows under his eyes, the way his fingers tightened around the cup like it was an anchor. There was something familiar in that. Wanting to make something that mattered, and being terrified you never would. "Maybe," she said gently, "they were waiting for a different version of you to draw them." He didn't answer, but for the first time he looked straight at her. Really looked. And in that quiet morning, over warm paper cups and cinnamon, the distance between the cleaning lady and the man in the dark shrank by a fraction no blueprint could measure. The employee break room on the ground floor of Luma Vest was no one's idea of inspiring design. The vending machines jammed every other week. The linoleum floors were scuffed into a permanent gray, and the plastic chairs looked like they'd been collected from 3 different decades. But for Adrian, it quietly became his favorite room in the building. At first, he went there once a week, just to step out of the executive glass box upstairs. Then it became every few days. Soon, nearly every morning, he showed up with his tablet tucked under one arm, dressed a little less like a CEO and a little more like a man trying to remember who he was before schedules and shareholders. Simple sweaters, sneakers instead of polished shoes. Nora was usually there before him, sitting at one of the wobbly tables, lunchbox at her side, a paper spread in front of her, or some printed article she'd salvaged from the recycling bin. She read everything: local arts sections, community projects, articles about mural programs in neighborhoods that looked a lot like the one she'd grown up in. Sometimes she clipped pictures and slid them carefully into a worn folder labeled Someday. Adrian pretended to focus on site plans and elevations as he sat a few tables away, but whenever she frowned thoughtfully at a sketch or smiled at a story, his eyes drifted. There was a steadiness to her, a resilience that lingered even when she looked tired, and it made the perfection of his polished office feel strangely hollow. One rainy afternoon, thunder rumbling behind the skyline, Nora came in with her hair damp and her jacket missing. Droplets clung to her sleeves, darkening the navy fabric. "You're soaked," Adrian said before he could stop himself. "I've had worse," she replied, rubbing her arms. Still, he could see the quiet shiver that ran through her. He pulled a dark gray hoodie from his messenger bag and held it out. "Here." "I'm fine," she insisted, teeth nearly chattering. "I know," he said gently. "Take it anyway." She sighed and slipped it on. As she slid her hands into the pockets, her fingers brushed against something crinkled. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, edges smudged with age. Opening it carefully, she found a crooked child's drawing of a little house with flower boxes beneath the windows, drawn in bright, clumsy colors. "Who drew this?" she asked. Adrian's gaze dropped to the table. "My foster sister, Laya," he said quietly. "We redesigned the group home she lived in when we were kids. When it reopened, she gave me that and told me it finally felt like a place that belonged to her." Nora smoothed the fragile paper with gentle thumbs, then folded it back up the way she'd found it and tucked it safely into the pocket. "Looks like you've known how to build hope for a long time," she murmured. "You just forgot it was yours." Something in his chest shifted at that. After that day, he began skipping some of the high-stakes pitch meetings he once considered sacred. Instead, he visited construction sites, asked workers what they needed: more shade where they ate lunch, quieter corners, better light where they took breaks. He listened more than he spoke, and each answer tugged him further from the version of himself that only chased awards. Every morning, he ordered a green smoothie from the downstairs cafe, the one Nora had once called liquefied regret. One day she passed him in the hallway, eyeing the cup. "Still pretending that tastes like virtue?" she teased. "I've accepted it tastes like my bad choices blended with kale," he replied dryly. And she laughed, the sound warm in the sterile corridor. Weeks later, after a late shift, they found themselves sitting side by side on the cold metal steps of the emergency stairwell, the building finally quiet. Rain tapped gently against the door, and the faint scent of cleaning fluid mingled with the distant smell of sawdust from the workshop below. "When I was 8, Adrian said suddenly, staring at his hands, "my dad gave me a stack of balsa wood and told me to build a house. No help, no instructions, just a ruler and silence." He swallowed. "I spent a month on it. When I showed him, he didn't say, 'Good job.' He just said, 'Next time, make sure the roof pitch matches the weather. No one forgives a bad roof.'" Nora watched him for a long moment, then laid her hand gently over his. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's time you stopped building for people who never learned how to live inside what you made and started building something new from the pieces that still matter." He didn't answer. But something in the angle of his shoulders relaxed, just a little, like a man who had finally found the first line of a blueprint he actually wanted to follow. Late on a quiet Saturday, the 34th floor of LumaVest felt like a museum after closing. Most of the staff had gone home hours earlier, leaving behind only the faint scent of coffee and dry erase markers. The conference room that usually buzzed with presentations and projections now sat in a rare hush. Nora pushed her cleaning cart out of the service elevator, the wheels squeaking softly over the polished concrete. She'd been assigned to the executive level for the night, a small change in the schedule she didn't think twice about. Sunlight was almost gone, leaving long silver streaks along the floor where the last of the evening light slipped through the tall windows. The big table in the center of the room was still cluttered from a long strategy session. Paper cups half full, scribbled notes, uncapped markers, and at the center, a delicate scale model of a proposed public library, its wooden frame pierced by cutout skylights like little wells of captured light. Nora gathered the empty cups and stacked napkins into a trash bag, moving on instinct, but the model kept pulling her gaze back. Next to it, a magazine lay slightly askew, its glossy cover catching what little light remained. She reached for it absent-mindedly, intending to move it out of the way. Then she saw the face on the front. Adrian. He stood in the photo half-turned, arms crossed in front of a curved timber pavilion, jaw relaxed, eyes distant. The headline curved over his shoulder. Adrian Cole, designing spaces that remember how to heal. Her breath stilled. The words below tightened something behind her ribs even more. In a bold pull quote, "My early years at Meridian Concepts taught me everything I needed to unlearn. Architecture isn't just form, it's memory and mercy." Meridian Concepts. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. That had been her first real chance after finishing her program, the firm where she'd once interned, where she'd stayed late tracing lines and shading elevations, telling herself this was how a future began. The place where, one gray afternoon, she'd been called into a small room and told her work was inconsistent, that they were moving in a different direction. No warning, no second review, just a quiet exit with a cardboard box. She'd blamed herself. Maybe she was too distracted trying to juggle shifts and hospital visits. Maybe she hadn't been talented enough. Months later, a former colleague had slipped her the truth in a whisper. Budget cuts, headcount, politics. She'd just been an easy name to circle. Now, here he was, not just a passing architect, not just the man in the dark. He had been there, at the firm that had quietly dropped her. Maybe not in the room that day, but somewhere close enough for his name to carry weight. Her chest burned, but no tears came. Instead, she reached for the small stack of sticky notes near the library model. Peeling one free, she took a pen from her pocket, the familiar click echoing softly. In neat, careful handwriting, she wrote, "Now I understand why you were crying that night. Goodbye, Adrian." She slid the note beneath the edge of the model's roof until just the corner showed. A sliver of yellow in a world of clean white and wood. Then Nora straightened, turned away, and pushed her cart back toward the elevator. When the doors closed behind her, the floor was still again. Only the soft hum of the building remained, and a small square of paper waiting in the quiet for the man who had once signed his name over the direction of her life without even knowing hers. Adrian returned to the 34th floor later that evening with the heavy tread of someone who wasn't sure why he'd come back, only that he couldn't quite go home yet. The building was nearly empty. The city outside had softened into a blur of lights and drizzle. He told himself he was just there to grab a few notes, maybe one more look at the library model before he tried to sleep. He stepped into the conference room and headed for the table automatically, reaching for a roll of tracing paper. That's when he saw it, a pale square of yellow tucked beneath the tiny balsa wood roof of the model. He slid it free, expecting a quick correction from a designer or a reminder from logistics. Instead, he saw the handwriting. Her handwriting. Clean, deliberate, as if every letter had been stitched into the page. "Now I understand why you were crying that night. Goodbye, Adrian." He read it once, then again. The words were simple, but the space between them was loud. The room around him seemed to fall away until it was only him, the model, and that small piece of paper that felt heavier than the whole building. He knew. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. Meridian. The article. The resignation in her eyes when she'd talked about dreams that had been interrupted. The note was more than goodbye. It was a quiet verdict. She had connected the dots. And now he had to do the same. Sleep became impossible. That night, in the half-light of his apartment, with the city humming faintly outside his windows, Adrian opened his laptop and logged into the archived systems from his old firm. His access should have expired, but somewhere in the tangle of transitions, his credentials still worked. He searched by date, by project, by a name that now pulsed like a heartbeat. Nora Ellis. Her dismissal sat at the bottom of a meeting summary, one dry line dressed up as corporate necessity. Not aligned with collaborative style, low leadership visibility, low risk to remove. The note wasn't even in his words. It was written by a former assistant who'd learned to speak like spreadsheets. He had simply approved it with a digital signature and moved on. His chest tightened. He dug deeper, opening project folders from that same period. He recognized the library proposal that had first brought her into the building. Drafts he'd praised in passing were now stripped bare. Sketches were cropped so that only the senior architect's markups remained. Her notes were gone, erased like someone had decided she'd never been there at all. This hadn't been a neutral decision. It had been a quiet erasure, and he had let it happen. The next morning, with clouds hanging low over the city, he stood outside a modest apartment building across the bay, clutching a small paper bag that smelled faintly of sugar and fried dough. An older woman in gardening gloves pointed him to the second floor. "She's hardly ever home before late," the woman said. "Long shifts?" He climbed the stairs anyway and knocked. No answer. He was about to knock again when he noticed a slip of paper tucked into the mail slot, his name written in the same neat script as the note by the model. "If it's you, I don't want to talk. What I thought was real was just another broken design." He stood there for a long moment, the words sinking in like cold rain. Then he sat down on the top step and let the mist soak into his jacket. For once, he didn't rush to fix anything. He just sat with what he'd broken. When he finally rose, he set the paper bag gently by her door. Inside was a box of strawberry-filled donuts, the comfort food she'd once said felt like being hugged by my mother. And beneath it, a sheet of sketch paper. On it, the library design had been reimagined, his clean lines softened by new curves, details inspired by her way of seeing the world. Across the top, in bold pencil, he had written just 2 words: Ellis Commons. At the bottom, in handwriting that trembled more than he wanted to admit, he'd added one sentence that had no blueprint. "Spaces only matter if they hold the people we harmed. I am sorry." A week slipped by before Nora finally noticed the paper bag waiting for her. It was late when she came home. The kind of late that made her bones feel older than they were. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge. On the kitchen counter, beside a small pile of unopened mail, sat the bag, softened at the corners. Her mother must have brought it in and decided not to ask. Nora stared at it for a long moment. Some part of her wanted to drop it straight into the trash, to refuse whatever apology it contained. She'd had enough of words that arrived too late. Still, her fingers reached out and loosened the top. Inside was a bakery box, faintly warm, the scent of sugar and strawberries curling up like a memory. She opened it. Strawberry-filled donuts, dusted with powdered sugar, sat in a neat circle. Her favorite. The kind she'd once joked felt like being hugged by someone you knew wouldn't leave. She should have thrown them out, closed the lid, walked away, proven to herself that she was done. Instead, she picked one up and took a bite. The filling melted instantly on her tongue. Sweet, familiar, so painfully gentle that her throat tightened. It tasted like a time before dismissal letters and late-night shifts, before she'd learned how quickly people could erase you. Only then did she notice the folded sheet of sketch paper tucked beneath the box. Her heart thudded as she unfolded it. The library design stared back at her, rendered with meticulous care. Wide windows opening onto a courtyard, soft angles bending like open arms, corners shaped into quiet reading nooks that felt like refuge. These were the kinds of spaces she used to doodle in the margins of her notebooks. Her dream filtered through his hand. At the bottom, in pencil so faint she almost missed it, he had written, "Spaces only matter if they can still hold the people we've hurt. I am sorry." Her breath hitched. Tears came without drama, just a steady, silent flow down her cheeks. Not because the building on the page was beautiful, though it was, but because, for once, someone wasn't pretending the damage hadn't happened. He wasn't trying to rewrite the story. He was trying to rebuild something inside it. On the other side of the bay, Adrian submitted a leave request for the first time since founding LumaVest. 2 full weeks. No meetings, no pitches, no walking into the glass room where her absence now felt louder than any presentation. He needed distance from the version of himself that had been all steel edges and spotless renderings. He joined a small volunteer project in a town south of the city, helping design an outdoor gathering space for a children's support center. No award panels, no glossy magazine spreads, just wood, garden beds, curved benches under young trees. A place meant for kids who knew too much about goodbyes. That's where he met Ava. She was small, with uneven pigtails and a pink dress she wore like armor. She hardly spoke, but her hands were always busy, braiding yarn, threading plastic beads, making tiny gifts she left on steps and tables like secret offerings. One afternoon, while Adrian was bent over a clipboard sketching sightlines, she walked up without a word and held something out to him, a bracelet. Handmade, imperfect, bright. Beads of different shapes and sizes strung together, and in the center, shaky letters spelling a single word, hope. He looked up, but she only smiled, as if that explained everything, and ran off toward the half-built garden. Adrian slid the bracelet onto his wrist, right next to the watch he'd worn in every boardroom victory. The contrast struck him. One object measuring time, the other reminding him why it mattered at all. He didn't take it off. Back in the city, life didn't pause just because something inside Nora had cracked and shifted. The buses still ran late, rent was still due, and the floors at Lumavest still needed mopping whether her heart felt steady or not. So she did what people who survive learn to do. She filled her days until there was almost no room left to think. One evening, as she was wiping down the lobby tiles on the ground floor, she heard someone say her name. Nora? She looked up to see Leo, a former colleague from her Meridian days, standing near the elevator with a messenger bag slung across his chest and paint smudges on his fingers. "I thought that was you," he said, eyes warm. "I've seen some of your old sketches online. You haven't stopped drawing, have you?" She let out a small laugh that sounded more tired than amused. "Life had other plans," she said. "Drawing's a luxury now." Leo shook his head. "We're starting a free open studio at the Community Arts Center downtown for people who let life interrupt their art." He smiled. "You should come. No pressure, no grades, just space." The phrase space lodged somewhere in her chest. She almost said no. Instead, a week later, she found herself standing in front of a blank canvas in a light-filled room that smelled of coffee and acrylics. There were no instructions, no red pen waiting, no senior architect glancing over her shoulder. Just her, a brush, and a white surface that didn't know anything about her past. Her hand trembled as she dipped into cobalt blue, then moved almost on instinct. Lines became walls. Color became breath. She stopped thinking about whether it was good enough and started asking herself what it felt like. She returned the next week, and the next. Her work shifted from charcoal sketches of narrow stairwells and empty chairs to layered paintings where buildings seemed to hover between construction and collapse. Her strokes were sometimes jagged, sometimes soft. Nothing looked quite finished, and somehow that felt honest. One of the instructors paused behind her one night, studying a piece where a room seemed to be opening and closing at once. "Your paintings feel like unfinished buildings," he said. "Not because they're lacking, but because they're still becoming." Nora didn't answer, but the words settled over her like a gentle blanket. When the center announced a small exhibition, they asked if she would submit a few pieces. She hesitated, then nodded. Among the canvases she brought was one she'd painted late after class, when the studio was nearly empty and the memory of a dim conference room wouldn't leave her alone. On it, she had painted a long glass-walled space, muted in color, with a single drafting table and a man hunched over it, his face hidden, his body melting into shadow. A single window poured an angled light that fell across his back like a quiet hand. She titled it simply, "The Man in the Dark." The day of the exhibition arrived on a cool, pale afternoon. The Community Arts Center didn't look like much from the street, just another brick building squeezed between a laundromat and a discount pharmacy. But inside, it had been transformed. Walls were freshly painted white, track lights adjusted to make every canvas feel seen. Voices drifted through the halls in low, reverent tones. Two of Nora's pieces were chosen, but the one hung in the center of the main gallery was the one she'd almost kept hidden. The Man in the Dark. She'd hesitated when they asked for a title card, then finally signed her name in looping ink. No artist statement. The painting already knew what it needed to say. Across town, Adrian sat in his office at home, surrounded by half-finished sketches for a senior community center. He should have been refining elevations, but his mind kept wandering. The apology drawing he'd left at her door, the donuts, the silence that followed. He was about to close his laptop when an article in his newsfeed caught his eye. A feature about community art and architecture, of all things. The headline mentioned, "A former architecture intern whose emotionally charged paintings explore the spaces where memory and shelter collide." The name beneath it stopped his breath, Nora Ellis. He clicked. The article was short, but full of phrases that lodged under his skin. Rooms that hold both harm and healing, structures that remember the people who were asked to leave. At the bottom was a small flyer for the exhibit, the address of the art center, and a list of featured works. One title stood out like a heartbeat: The Man in the Dark. Adrian didn't think. He grabbed his coat and keys and left before he could talk himself out of it. By the time he stepped into the gallery, dusk had settled outside. The rooms glowed softly, each painting lit like a small confession. He stayed near the back, keeping his cap low, moving slowly until he reached the center of the main room. There it was. He recognized the space immediately, the long glass-walled conference room from LumaVest. Only this version was stripped of polish. The drafting table sagged under abandoned papers. Blueprints curled at the edges. The only light came from a high, angled window, spilling across the slumped figure at the table. Him, not in detail, not in features, but in posture, in surrender. The man's face was buried in his arms, his shape dissolving into the shadows like someone who wasn't sure he deserved to take up space. On the back wall, faintly painted, were words in his own handwriting, words he'd once scribbled in a notebook and then forgotten. The foundation is feeling. Beneath the canvas, written in silver ink on the title card, another line shimmered under the gallery lights. When I saw him in the dark, I realized not everyone who looks strong is unbreakable. Adrian reached out, fingertips hovering just shy of the frame. His throat burned. He hadn't cried in years where anyone could see, but this was his private collapse turned into a story bigger than his own shame. It was the room that had broken them both, frozen in paint, given a window where there had only been 4 walls. He felt her before he heard her. It still feels like that room sometimes, Nora said quietly behind him. He turned. She stood there in a simple black dress dusted with faint flecks of paint, her hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't look like the woman in the uniform anymore. She looked like someone who had walked through fire and decided to keep walking. Her eyes weren't soft, but they weren't closed either. Not anymore. He didn't trust his voice, so he didn't speak. Neither did she. Some things were too deep for language. Instead, she lifted her hand. He lifted his. Their fingers met and clasped. Not as employer and employee, not as the man who signed the dismissal and the woman who bore its weight, but as 2 people who had both been shattered by the same space and were, somehow, learning how to stand inside it again. Around them, the gallery noise faded to a hum. Between them, the painting remained, a witness in pigment and light, marking the precise moment where ruins stopped being the end of the story, and quietly, bravely, became the beginning of something else. 1 month later, the elevator chimed softly as it reached the 34th floor. Nora watched the numbers blink to a stop, feeling her pulse beat in time with each flicker. She hadn't been back up here since the night she'd left that yellow note beneath the library model. When Adrian's message had arrived, "If you ever want to see what became of that room, I'll be here tonight." She'd stared at it for a long time before typing a simple, "Okay." The hallway was quieter than she remembered, washed in warm evening light instead of harsh fluorescence. At the end waited the familiar glass door that had once felt like a boundary she was never meant to cross. Her palm hovered over the handle for a moment, then pushed gently. The room that greeted her wasn't the same room she'd cleaned under dim emergency lights. Soft golden light filtered down from a reworked ceiling, angled panels of frosted glass catching the last of the sun and the first glimmer of the city beyond. The heavy walls were gone, replaced with translucent partitions that reflected the skyline in soft, broken constellations. The long conference table had vanished. In its place, at the center of the room, stood a low pedestal under a quiet spotlight. Her painting rested there. The Man in the Dark, framed, steady, treated like a cornerstone instead of an accident. Behind it, mounted on a brushed metal plate, were words etched in clean lines. "Kindness is never forgotten." Nora exhaled slowly, the sound almost a laugh, almost a sob. She turned just as footsteps approached. Adrian stood near the far window. No tie, no boardroom armor, just a dark blazer over an open-collar shirt, the bead bracelet from Ava still around his wrist. He walked toward her, not like a man crossing his territory, but like someone approaching the most delicate part of a structure he was afraid to damage. He took her hands in his, warm and steady. "I've designed so many spaces," he said, voice low, honest. But none of them ever really felt alive until you walked into this one that night and quietly refused to let me collapse alone. She held his gaze, searching. There was no practiced speech in his eyes this time, no polished pitch. Just a man who had finally stepped out from behind his renderings. "When I saw you in the dark," she murmured, "I thought you were just another person who had everything and still found a way to feel empty." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "Now I know you were just unfinished." A faint smile tugged at his mouth, raw and relieved. Maybe we both were. They stood there in the soft, reflected light. Two people who had once passed each other like ghosts in the same building, now finally standing in the same room as themselves. The city glowed beyond the glass, thousands of windows burning like quiet promises that even in the highest, coldest places, people still lived, still hurt, still tried again. They moved closer without really thinking about it, like two beams that had finally found the angle where they could hold weight together. Adrian pulled her gently into his arms, and Nora let her forehead rest against his shoulder. No grand declarations, no dramatic music, just the sound of their breathing, steadying in the same rhythm. For the first time, the room that had held so much failure felt like somewhere you could actually exhale. Soft footsteps echoed from the side entrance. They pulled apart just enough to look toward the doorway as a small figure appeared, half hiding behind the newly frosted glass panel. Ava stepped into the light, her familiar pink dress now edged with tiny sewn-on sparkles. Her pigtails were crooked, as always, and her arms were cupped together as if she were carrying something precious. "Can I come in?" she asked, eyes wide. "You already did," Adrian said, smiling as he knelt to her height. Nora sank down beside him. Ava beamed and uncapped her hands. Resting in her palms was another bracelet, beads mismatched and bright. In the center, two short words were spelled out in wobbly letters, one on each side of a small heart charm. "Love" and "Forgive." "I made this one for both of you," she said seriously, "so you don't forget what this place is for." Nora's throat tightened. Ava lifted the bracelet carefully, and Nora held out her hand. Little fingers fastened it around her wrist, right beside the faint tan line where rubber gloves usually sat. She looked at Adrian. He looked back, eyes damp, the ghost of the man in the painting flickering and then softening. She nodded once, a small but unmistakable yes, to his apology, to their strange shared history, to the possibility of something true being built from everything that had broken. They rose together, hands intertwined, the bracelet dangling between them like a tiny, bright piece of architecture holding two separate lives in the same circle. Above them, the redesigned ceiling caught the last of the day and scattered it across the walls, turning the room into a wash of gold. Behind them, the man in the dark stood not as a monument to despair, but as evidence that even the worst nights can become part of a different story. In this space, no longer just a conference room, no longer just a site of collapse. There was breath, memory, and a quiet, persistent kind of hope that didn't ask for permission anymore. It simply stayed. Thank you for staying with this story of second chances, silent kindness, and the way love can slowly rebuild what careless decisions once broke. If this story made you pause, breathe deeper, or feel a little less alone tonight, we'd be honored to walk with you through many more. Tap the like button to let us know you're here. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more late-night tales that speak to the heart, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story that might be exactly what you need on a hard day. Until we meet again, take gentle care of yourself, and keep a little space in your life for hope.